Okay, we're finishing chapter 49. We're going to go into chapter 50 today. Chapter 50 is the last chapter of the book of Genesis, and so we'll be finishing the book of Genesis in the next couple of months. And so, all right, a few of you paying attention. No, we'll finish it up. We'll finish it up very soon, but not tonight. And so we'll look at the end of chapter 49. But remember what's been going on in chapter 49. The big event in chapter 49 is Jacob, also known as Israel, the patriarch, the last of the patriarchs, is blessing his 12 sons. And remember, these blessings are blessings, kind of, we called them, because they're not all super positive. As a matter of fact, a lot of these blessings, you wouldn't want somebody to prophesy this about your family or your descendants. But Jacob doesn't just speak his mind, doesn't just speak what he thinks about these boys. He really speaks prophetically, and we see those answered. We kind of talked about that already in the last couple of weeks about how God brought these things to fruition. And we saw those, we've seen those already in the history, just in the Bible. And so he kind of finishes that blessing. And it strikes me, there's 12 sons. You got Joseph has the two, Ephraim and Manasseh, so he gets this double portion. They're all addressed. These 12 sons are all addressed in chapter 49. And like I said, not all positive. But when you get to the promised land, you'll notice that each of the 12 tribes still gets their allotment. Now, technically, Levi just gets cities. He doesn't get a big land allotment, but he gets his allotment from the temple and his special calling that God has for the Levites. And so I just point that out because, it's not all positive for the boys in chapter 49, but they all have an allotment. They all have a stake in the promised land. And so I think I draw that application for us tonight that, we may not all have the same allotment here on earth as believers, even as believers, as followers of Jesus. Think about that globally, right? There's definitely places where it's a lot worse to be a Christian than in Cushing, Oklahoma. Right? Just think about California. I'm sorry. Think about third world countries. They're just terrible places where they're mistreated and persecuted and they're, relinquished to have a life of poverty and fear. Why? Because they're a believer. And so we have a different allotment than them, but we all have a stake in the promised land as believers. So you might look around you and think, wow, that Christian has this, or that Christian has that, or they get to do this, or they get to do that. I wish I got that, or and maybe that's what Levi would say about Issachar's allotment in the promised land, or something along those lines. The fact is, they all are members of Jacob's family. They're members of God's family. They're all part of the 12 tribes, and we all have a stake in the promised land, no matter what our allotment is here on earth. And so Jacob has done that blessing for all these sons. We finish that up. These are his final words, his final instructions. So literally, we'll see tonight, he finishes what he's saying. He's got the 12 boys in front of him. He finishes what he says, saying to them, and then he dies. His life will end tonight. And the fact of the matter is that Jacob is ready. Jacob's been through some stuff in his life. He's seen some things in his life. If you recall, just kind of rewind in your mind just for a moment tonight. Remember some of the events of his life. His life was contentious from the womb. Remember? His mother experienced all these symptoms during labor. What's going on? She sought the Lord. The Lord said, there's 2 nations in your womb. There was a battle going on even before he was born. And that didn't end once he was born. The back and forth with his brother Esau continued throughout his life. And eventually, he has to run away from his brother Esau, who is trying to kill him. He lands in his uncle's home in Padan Aram and strikes up a deal with his uncle to work for 7 years for his bride. He's tricked by his uncle, Laban, and he has to work for 14 years. And he ends up with 2 brides. And there's all the contention that goes along with them and their maidservants who become his brides. So he's got 4 wives, and things are messy in his life, as you remember and then as you can imagine. Then his father-in-law tracks him down when he tries to flee. I believe his father-in-law was going to kill him in that moment, but the Lord stopped him from doing that. Then he had to deal with in his life, don't forget, the death, air quotes there, death of Joseph, the loss of Joseph in his life. Terrible tragedy that he goes through. He has other problems with his sons. Remember Simeon and Levi killing the men of Shechem, and the problems with Judah and Reuben. He's got all kinds of son problems. He loses his wives. He experiences the death of his two wives. And then, at the age of 130 years old, there's a terrible famine in the land that he lives in, and that he's lived in his whole life, and he has to relocate to a whole new country. And I don't think anybody in here is 130 years old, but I just imagine if you had to pick up stakes right now, whatever age you are, and relocate to a whole other country, that would be a little traumatic, right? That'd be a big deal, a major event in your life. I imagine that's what happened to him at 130 years old. At this point in chapter 49, he's 147. He's ready to go. Remember, he told Pharaoh, when Pharaoh met him and asked how old he was, he said that few and evil have been the days of his life. He's been through some stuff. He's seen some things. He's ready to go. And what he's doing here in chapter 49 is not delaying the inevitable. He's preparing for what's coming. And here's the phrase we usually say, he's getting his affairs in order. That's how we normally, that's what the doctors say when they give you a terminal condition or a terminal diagnosis. They say, go home, get your affairs in order. Isn't that what they say? And here's what's true. Every single one of us have a terminal condition. It's called life. It's 100% fatal. And I doubt, seriously, I don't care how many vegetables you eat or how much yoga you do, you're probably not going to live to 147. But no matter how old you are, I think even now it's smart to make sure your affairs are in order. A couple of ways I mean that. Spiritually. Jacob's affairs are in order spiritually. His faith is strong here. His life has not always been characterized by strong faith. But in these last years of his life, we see him close to the Lord. His faith, his trust in God is strong. So spiritually, he's prepared. You got to make sure that you are spiritually prepared for your death, which is coming. Another thing that he is prepared for, and this is what we see really tonight, is his physical preparations for death. I mean, he's saying what needs to be said. He's not leaving things undone with his family. He's making sure they all know where they stand. He's said everything God wants them to hear, and he's getting that all taken care of. He's going to make, tonight in this study, he's going to make funeral preparations. He's going to tell them exactly where he wants to be buried. These are good things. And so, are your affairs in order? You need to have your affairs in order. Spiritually, you need to be ready to meet Jesus one day, but physically even, you need to be prepared for your death. And let me give you some application on that. Especially if you have, if you're a dad and you have children in the home, you need to have some life insurance or some financial preparation for your family. Your responsibility to take care of your family, men, does not end at your death. You need to make sure they're going to be taken care of if you have an untimely end. That's a good advice. Also, and this is something I've not done, but as I think about it, it's something I need to do. It's something I've thought about, just never actually written it down. Maybe you might be in the same boat as me. But you need to have some thoughts prepared, something written out for the way you want your funeral to go. Some of you think, well, I don't care. I don't care how my funeral will go. I'll be with Jesus. They can do whatever they want. But listen, it's not for you. It's not for you, is it? Funerals aren't for the dead. Funerals are for the living. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with a family who's lost a dearly beloved family member, and they just are lost. They don't know the first thing. They call me, do we have to pay to rent the church to have a funeral? I mean, they ask questions like they don't know what to do. They ask crazy things like that. Well, we don't know. Well, did you think about any kind of music for the service? Well, we don't know what kind of music. Well, what was their favorite song? Well, we don't know. You know what you could do? You just jot some stuff down. Hey, here's my favorite song. Play this at my funeral. Hey, here's my favorite verse. Tell the preacher to preach on that. Hey, tell the preacher, make sure and share the gospel at my funeral because I want people to hear about Jesus. Their last thought of me, I want to make sure they're hearing the gospel. How about that? Write that stuff down. And then you know what you write at the bottom? Here, this is good. Remember this. And at the bottom say, or whatever the family wants. Say that. Because it'll be a really big relief to your family to know what you wanted. But there might be something that they want to add or they want to change. Well, we can't because this is what Mom said. This is what she wanted. And you'll give them that little bit of permission to make any changes or additions that they want to. But they'll know what you wanted. Isn't that a great idea? So you should do that. Or you can write that down. You can send it in an email. You can send it to one of your family members. You can put it in a file. You can go to the funeral home and sit down with the funeral director, and they'll do all this with you. They have a form that you fill out with them. And if you really want to be prepared, you can go ahead and pay for the funeral while you're there. And your family will be really thankful you did that, won't they? Make preparation. Put your affairs in order. It's good advice. Spiritually, also physically. That's what he's going to do. And I say we're going to read just a moment his death. Here's what you see about this is I think he dies well. He gets it all done. He says what he needs to do, and when he's done, he literally lays down and he's gone. He doesn't leave anything undone. He does everything and says everything he needs to say. So join me there in chapter 49, and we are in verse 29. Then he commanded them. This was Jacob once again. He just finished the blessing. And he says this, I'm about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron the Hittite. The cave is in the field of Machpelah near Mamre in the land of Canaan. This is the field Abraham purchased from Ephron the Hittite as burial property. Abraham and his wife Sarah are buried there. Isaac and his wife Rebekah are buried there. And I buried Leah there. The field and the cave in it were purchased for the Hittites, or from the Hittites. When Jacob had finished giving the charges to his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, took his last breath, and was gathered to his people. And so with that, we have the end of the age of the patriarchs. Jacob, the last one, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is dead. He's gone. Notice the last thing he says here. He repeats this instruction to bury me with my ancestors. Now, he's already told Joseph that in chapter 47. Remember, he called Joseph in for a special little meeting. He's got the birthright. He's the number one son. He's the firstborn. Technically, he's the 11th born, but he has that seat of firstborn priority, and he gives him that instruction in chapter 47. He elaborates on it right here. Now, typically, people are buried in a place close to their family so that their family can go visit their grave. Is that normal? Isn't that usual? I think so. Remember, his family is going to be here in Egypt for the next 400 years. Most of us don't know the names of any of our relatives from 400 years ago. So you would think just logically, it's going to be a while. Why don't you just leave me here? That way the kids can visit my grave here in Egypt. But he doesn't do that. He says, where? Take me back to where my ancestors are buried. He says Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah and Leah. A couple of phrases here that he uses. He says, bury me with my fathers. And so, a couple of times. Bury me with my fathers. And then at the end of that section, it says he was gathered to his peoples. That's kind of a different idea there, and I'll explain that a little bit more in just a second. But that's what he wants. Now, why does he want to be buried there? Did anybody notice a name that stuck out to you in that list? So you have Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah are all buried there. That's where he wants to be buried. What name in that list sticks out to you? Is it Leah? Yeah. Because why? That was the wife he didn't really want. Rachel is the beloved wife, right? Rachel is buried. Remember, on their way to Bethel, she dies, and she's buried essentially near Bethlehem, kind of a roadside grave, if you will, on their journey. So she doesn't make it there. But Leah is buried there because it worked out that she could be buried in that family cave or that family plot, we would say today. And so we would usually bury somebody next to their spouse. If they had more than one spouse, sometimes you just got to pick or whatever one was more important, or you bury them all together or whatever, however it works. But here, he wants to be buried not necessarily next to his spouse. That's not really a factor here. The factor is he wants to be buried in the land of Canaan, in this ancestral place with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah. And it's not sentimentality. It's not that he just wants to be where his family is. It's not that he feels a certain kinship to that place because that's where his grandfather and his father are buried and his mother are buried. No, that's not what it is. It's much more than that. He has a long-term perspective here. He knows it's going to be 400 years from this point, but he knows that God has promised the land of Canaan to him and his descendants perpetually. It'll be their land. God's going to give it to him. He doesn't get to realize it. He doesn't get to see it with his own eyes. But essentially, here's what he says. By faith, he says, plant me in the promised land because God is going to plant a nation of our descendants there one day. And I want to be where they are, the land God has given us. And he believes in this resurrection, and it's going to take place. But in the meantime, he just said, I want to be a part of what God is going to do there. He didn't get to see the nation. I mean, his descendants will become the nation of Israel, several million people under King David, under King Solomon. This huge, powerful nation will come from his lineage. He doesn't get to see it here on earth, but he gets to be there in his burial. And it's his faith that says this, put me there because I know God's going to bring us back there. And he just wanted to have a part of that. And as I was studying that this week, this passage, I was reminded of somebody many of you know very well. Her name was Shirley Roseborough. Remember Miss Shirley? The reason why she sticks out to me is because when we were building this building, she was trying to hang on long enough to have her funeral in this building. And she was terribly sick. Every time you talked to her, that's what she'd tell you. She wanted to have her funeral in this building, and she passed away before we got to move in here. But we had her funeral right out in the lobby. There was no sheetrock, no tile on the floor, just concrete and steel in the air. But she got to be a part of it. That was her desire. She didn't get to realize this, that we get to enjoy week after week, but she just wanted to have a little part of it. And she wanted to have her service here. Now, we got in a little bit of trouble with the building inspector over that deal because we didn't have an occupancy permit. And I remember Roger Floyd, who's also passed now, our funeral director, I remember him calling me and said, hey, Mike, we're in trouble. We're going to get a ticket. And I remember him saying, but don't worry about it. I'm going to take care of it. Whatever, it's not going to hurt the church at all. I'm going to take care of it. Any fines, any penalties, I'll take care of it. I said, okay. He called me back about an hour later and said, I just talked to the city manager. Everything's fine. Everything's good. The city manager had said that the building inspector was wrong and we did the right thing. And if it happens again, let him know. And he would park a fire truck in the parking lot if that's what we needed for fire safety in our unfinished building. I remember that. I thought that was awesome. But that was Shirley Roseborough's perspective. She wanted to have a part of this building. And there was countless others before her that didn't get to realize, even just when we're not in the promised land, but I'm just making an application, we get to enjoy this wonderful facility. And it's because of people who by faith saw it, even though they never got to realize it. And that's one example of somebody who wanted to have a part of it. This is Jacob. He says, put me in that cave. We saw Abraham buy that cave for Sarah in the book of Genesis. He purchases, he owns part of the promised land. That's a big deal in Genesis chapter 25. And then it says that he died, and it says he was gathered. This is Jacob, gathered to his people. So he says, first of all, in chapter 29, or verse 29, bury me with my fathers. And then it says, at the end, it says he was gathered to his people. He wasn't just gathered to his ancestors. He's buried with his fathers. That's what it's talking about. He's put with his ancestors. But when he's gathered to his people, that's a little bit different phrase. You see that phrase, bury me with my fathers, a lot in the Kings. So 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, 1st, 2nd Samuel. When the age of the kings in Israel, a king will die. They'll say what he did in his life, and it'll say, and he was buried with his fathers. And that means he was buried in the plot with his ancestors. But when it says he's gathered to his people, that's a little bit different phrase. And that usually refers to a person who dies and goes to heaven. I think that's what's happening here. His people are the people of God. And that's the picture of death for a believer. When a believer no longer is alive here on earth, we are gathered to our people in a heavenly place. Now notice, there's no intermediary state. It doesn't say he went to a waiting room. It doesn't say he went to a purgatory or any kind of intermediary. No, he was gathered to his people. And Jesus in Matthew chapter 22 is questioned by the Sadducees. And remember, the Sadducees don't believe in a resurrection. That's why they are sad. You see, there you go. Good job. Y'all remembered. Hey, that's right. So they don't believe it. So they're questioning Jesus about the resurrection. So you just know they're up to no good. And they come up with this crazy scenario about a woman who was married to a guy and he died. So she was married to his brother and he died, and married to his brother and he died, and he married to his brother and he died, which is totally crazy because that would never happen in real life. After 2 or 3 brothers, they would get the hint and stop marrying that gal because she's the Black Widow or whatever. I mean, she's just taking them out, poisoning their coffee or something. But anyways, they come up with this crazy scenario to try to trick Jesus, and Jesus responds to them and basically tells them that they are in error because they don't know the Scriptures or the power of God. And these are the religious elite of the day. And he just told them, you guys are ignorant of God's Word and God's power. You're supposed to be experts in that. You don't know anything about either one. And he says, concerning the resurrection, this is chapter 22, verse 31 of Matthew, of the dead, haven't you read that what was spoken to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. And so the picture there is that when Jacob dies here in chapter 49 of the book of Genesis, he's gathered to his people. He's back with Abraham. He's back with Isaac. Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are alive in heaven right now. And so he doesn't just go in the ground. He just doesn't go in a tomb. He goes to heaven to be with Jesus forever. Now, why does he get to go to heaven? Because he did a lot of good things? He didn't do that many good things. He actually did a lot of bad things. If we're going to take score. No. Jacob got to go to heaven when he died. He was gathered to his people when he died because he had faith. Anybody and everybody who goes to heaven when they die go there because of their faith, not works. Matter of fact, faith apart from works is how Jacob was saved. Well, faith in what? Because didn't Jesus have to die for our sins, for us to be right with God and to go to heaven when we die? So how do these Old Testament saints get to go? They must be by works. They must have had to do stuff. No. The New Testament makes this very clear. Abraham was saved by faith. Isaac, Jacob, they're all saved by faith, not by works. So then how did Jesus die for their sins? Do they have to go to a waiting room? And then when Jesus died, then they got to go into heaven after. People believe that. But no, that's not what it says here. It says he was gathered to his people. So the cross, and the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross was retroactive and proactive. Okay, so it's Jesus died for the sins of everyone who was alive at that time, in the AD 30s, approximately. He also died for the sins of everybody who's lived since then. That's us. We're part of that group. But he also died for the sins of everyone before then, including the Old Testament saints. So it had a retroactive effect. His faith was in God to provide for his sins, and Jesus did that. So his faith was in God, and Jesus' death and resurrection from the dead had a retroactive effect on the Old Testament saints. So that's why he's there. And so he's gathered to his people. There's a distinction there. Notice it doesn't say he's gathered to all people. It doesn't say he's gathered to everyone who's ever died. Not everyone who's ever died is part of his people. It's part of God's people. Not everyone who's ever died is in heaven right now. Not everyone who's ever died is in that place. But this place with his people, we call heaven, is a place of perfect unity and tranquility. And you think about all the trouble that Jacob had in his life. And I named them a lot of them. But that was probably the tip of the iceberg. He probably had a lot more trouble we don't even know about. He stepped into a place in heaven free from all of that trouble with his people. And every one of those relationships that he had with people who are also believers were suddenly completely, perfectly restored. Can you imagine a situation where there's no problems with anybody in your life at all? Every relationship in your life has perfect unity. That's what heaven's like. There's no arguments or contention. Listen, there's not even denominations. You know what I mean? Not to say that heaven's non-denominational. The non-denominational folks would love to say that, okay? No, it's just that you're either a believer or you're not. Now, denominations have their place here on earth. I mean, people who have honest, wholehearted belief in what God's Word says can come to different conclusions about what it means and how to apply that. There'd be a doctrinal difference or a theological disagreement, and that's why we have denominations. People who are well-meaning, but just understand God's Word differently and have different disagreements on that. And so, matter of fact, not long ago, I was at a church in town. I won't tell you which one, just in case this is embarrassing to him. But a pastor told me, and this is a true story. This is a true story. A pastor told me, he said, Southern Baptist. And I said, yeah, we're Southern Baptist. He goes, you know what? If I wasn't my denomination, I'd be a Southern Baptist. I said, all right. I said, well, you know what? If I wasn't a Southern Baptist, I'd be ashamed. And so, that's a joke. That's a joke. That's my denomination joke, so you're welcome. He took it like a champ. And so that's it. So imagine that. Christians will live in perfect unity. There'll be one church. There won't be any preachers. I mean, like, preachers will be in heaven, but, but they won't be preaching. Some preachers will be in heaven. Not all of them, all right? I know some. We'll just gather around Jesus. Just worship Him. That's heaven. Perfect unity. That's what it means to say He was gathered to His people. Can you imagine? Chapter 50, verse 1 says this, Then Joseph, leaning over his father's face, wept and kissed him. So, literally, the boys are all gathered. He's given the blessing. He's given these final burial instructions. He lays back on his bed, and it says that he draws his feet into the bed, takes his last breath, and boom, just like that, he's in the presence of Jesus forevermore. Joseph leans over his father's face, it says, and wept and kissed him. You notice the affection that Joseph has for his father. Generally speaking, there's a little bit of an ick factor when it comes to dead bodies. We're generally kind of grossed out by that, but you notice just the overwhelming deep love that Joseph has for his father, even though his lifeless body is laying there at 147 years old. He still weeps over him. He still kisses him. You can just imagine him embracing his father one last time. Verse 2 says, he commanded his servants who were physicians to embalm his father. So they embalmed Israel. They took 40 days to complete this, for embalming takes that long, and the Egyptians mourned over him for 70 days. Now, you have these last final moments, and that's why I say he dies well. He says everything that needs to be said. He gives all the instructions. He makes all the preparation. And as soon as all that's done, he draws his last breath, and he's gone. Joseph kisses him. He's got that role. You see that role here, don't you, of firstborn. He's the one in charge. In this situation, all the other brothers are there, but who's in charge? Joseph. Joseph takes command. He commanded his servants who are physicians to embalm his father. Egypt, ancient Egypt, I should say, is known for two things that they did really well. Pyramids, right? Mummies. Embalming. And it's even said today that some of these Egyptian pharaohs that were even alive at this point, as a matter of fact, Ramses II, who's the pharaoh during the Exodus, his sarcophagus was discovered. His body was so well preserved that there's still skin on it. There's still teeth in his head. There's still hair. I don't even have hair now. You know what I mean? He's still got it all these years later, thousands of years later. And so they were really good at it. And so they were going to embalm him. Now, there's two Jewish people, Israelites in the Old Testament, who are embalmed. Jacob and Joseph are the only two. He does this. This is not normal for Jewish people. Usually Jewish people would bury you within 24 hours of your death. And at the time of burial, a 7-day mourning period would start. They would mourn for 7 days. That's the same, the Feast of Tabernacle was a 7-day feast, so they would mourn as long as they feasted. That was what their tradition was. It's what the rabbis taught. However, remember, Jacob has told him to bury him far away. It will take a long time to get there. So this is partially an honor, very expensive to be embalmed, a 40-day process. So you can imagine how much that would cost. So Joseph does this to his father to honor him, but also pragmatically because they're going to take a long journey through the desert. Remember Lazarus, when Jesus was going to call Lazarus out of the grave? He says, roll the stone away. And Martha says, oh, no, Lord, it's been 4 days. And in the King James it says, he stinketh. And so there's some stuff starts happening pretty quick with a dead body. And so he go ahead and embalms him. And they're going to take this long trip. And it says that they mourned 70 days. Now, in Egypt, when a pharaoh would die, it was customary that all of Egypt would mourn for 72 days. And so this is a very high honor. Because of Joseph's high status in Egypt, this high honor is placed on Jacob because of the long period of mourning that takes place. Verse 4 says, when the days of mourning were over, Joseph said to Pharaoh's household, if I have found favor with you, please tell Pharaoh that my father made me take an oath saying, I'm about to die. You must bury me there in the tomb that I made for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go and bury my father, then I will return. Notice Joseph doesn't speak directly to Pharaoh. Commentators point that out. He speaks to Pharaoh's household. It's usually, in most ancient societies, it would be illegal to speak to a monarch, a pharaoh, a king, if you were in mourning. You only went to the king with a smile on your face. That was the law. So if you were in mourning, matter of fact, when Nehemiah is approached, before he's going to go back and rebuild Jerusalem, he's serving the king there, and he is seen to be downtrodden. Remember, the king asks him about that. Why are you downtrodden? And it says Nehemiah was terrified. You're not supposed to be downtrodden in front of the king. So that's what's happening here. So Joseph doesn't speak to Pharaoh directly. He speaks to his household and gets permission to go bury his father. Pharaoh tells him, verse 6, to go bury your father. So then Joseph went to bury his father. Listen to this. And all Pharaoh's servants, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt went with him, along with all of Joseph's families, his brothers and his father's family. Only their dependents, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. Horses and chariots went up with him. It was a very impressive procession, to say the least, right? That's the biggest funeral recorded in the Bible. That's a huge group of people. Sometimes, you'll be driving down Main Street or something, and a funeral procession will come by, and you go, oh no, you got to pull over. Has this ever happened to you? And you pull over, and the funeral procession goes by, and it just keeps going and going and going and going and going, and then you're like, maybe these people just have their headlights on. Are they still part of the... But it just continues and goes and goes. Imagine this funeral procession. Horses and chariots, all the people of Pharaoh's household, all of Jacob's family, all the elders of Egypt, and commentators point out horses and chariots might refer to the army. I mean, all these dignitaries and important people are traveling to a foreign country, so they probably had an armed escort to get them there. It's probably a gigantic funeral procession. And so they continue on. Verse 10, when they reached the threshing floor of Adad, which is across the Jordan, they lamented and wept loudly, and Joseph mourned 7 days for his father. So they get back to the land of Canaan, and they start that customary 7-day mourning period. They've already mourned 70 days, but remember, that was just an honor in Egypt. Here, they're actually in the land of Canaan. This is the Jewish mourning period. And so during that 7-day mourning period, you see that they lament, they weep loudly. It's usually customary that nobody will take a shower or bathe in any kind of way. Women wouldn't wear any kind of makeup. People would not take care of themselves very well at all during that mourning period. No parties, no celebrations, nothing. It's a time of sadness. They do that. It says, when the Canaanite inhabitants of the land saw the mourning at the threshing floor at Adad, they said, this is a solemn mourning on the part of the Egyptians. Therefore, the place is named Abel Mizraim. It is across the Jordan. Verse 12, so Jacob's sons did for him what he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave at Machpelah in the field near Mamre, which Abraham had purchased as burial property from Ephraim the Hittite. After Joseph buried his father, he returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone with him to bury his father. So they mourn for 7 days. It's such a lavish funeral procession and everything that the Canaanites who still live there renamed the place where they stopped to camp and to mourn Abel Mizraim, which means the mourning of the Egyptians. Not mourning like early in the day, mourning with a U, mourning of the Egyptians, or mourning of Egypt. And so we have here the final words and the death of the final patriarch. Last final words of Jacob. I still remember my grandfather's last words to me. They were, "Are you still holding the ladder?" And that was a joke. I'm just kidding. Sorry. Some of you didn't know if you should laugh or not. Sorry. I did have a friend whose grandfather told him his last words were pint, liter, gallon. Pint, liter, gallon. He said it meant volumes to him. I don't know. I don't get it. But way to end on a strong note. And so you have Jacob's final words to his family. His last words. And then he dies. He's done everything he needs to do. He's made all the preparations, the spiritual preparations. He's made the physical preparations. They know exactly what to do. There's no questions. There's nothing left to consider. When he dies, they just do what he wants him to do. He dies well. Wouldn't you say? He dies well. His last words. Let me remind you of the last words of somebody else nearby about 3,000 years later. It was Jesus hanging on a cross. And his last words were, if you recall, it is finished. Jesus says, I've done everything necessary. The price has been paid. Your salvation has been purchased. Everything that you need to be right with God, to be spiritually prepared, everything you need is taken care of. Jesus made all the preparations for you to die well. Let me ask you the last question, though. Are your affairs in order? Are your affairs in order? Because you're not guaranteed to be 147. You're not guaranteed another moment, another minute on this earth. It'll come most likely at an unexpected time. Hopefully you get to have a moment like this right before you die, but most likely you won't. Are you prepared? Are you ready? Do you have your affairs in order? Jesus dying on the cross made it possible for us to be ready for death. We can approach death the way Jacob did, without fear, without sadness. We can be ready to go. No matter how hard your life has been, no matter how difficult you have it here on earth, you can look forward to a time where you will be gathered with your people. Step into perfect unity with the Father and everyone else who's a believer who's gone before you. You can be ready by faith. Jesus paid for your sins. I hope you are ready today. Let's pray. Father,